Very good. Well, welcome everyone that's joining us on Zoom across Alaska, and we appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join with us and talk about how permanent is permanent. Uh, Welcome to Commonwealth North's April program. I am Terry Smith, President of Commonwealth North, and these are unusual times, and we're reaching out in new and different ways and learning as we go. So we appreciate your patience and ideas as we work to make this a better way to communicate, as we have to stay removed from one another, which is hard for us all, as we are people that like to congregate and be close. So thank you for joining us today. And our debate today is on the necessity or lack thereof on the topic of inflation proofing the Alaska Permanent Fund since the advent of the percent of market value draw. That draw is now the largest source of revenue for the state of Alaska. The Permanent Fund was created by voters in 1976 and has matured over the past 44 years. It is now a world-class sovereign wealth fund. Commonwealth North has a long history of study and evaluation of the Permanent Fund. Last November, we hosted a debate on the merits of restructuring the Permanent Fund as an endowment fund. Our most recent report wholly focused on the fund at a crossroads, the Permanent Fund, Alaskans and Alaskans' Future. It is available at commonwealthnorth.org/publications. Today's debate is a continuing effort to examine the issues, challenges, and opportunities that are shaping the Permanent Fund now and into the future. At this time, I'd like to introduce today's debaters. Mr. Ralph Townsend is the director of UAA Institute of Social and Economic Research. He received a PhD in economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has 30 years of experience in higher education and government, including research, administration, and teaching. Ralph has studied a range of public policy issues, including healthcare policy, antitrust, and regulatory policy in education finance. Craig Richards is an attorney in private practice and serves as chair of the Alaska Permanent Fund Board of Trustees. Richards has experience in complex matters relating to finance, oil and gas, and tax law. He previously served as the Attorney General for the state of Alaska from 2014 to 2016. Craig majored in finance at the University of Virginia, earned an MBA from Duke University, and a JD from Washington and Lee University. Additionally, Craig and Ralph are both members of the Commonwealth North Board of Directors. Gentlemen, welcome and thank you. As audience members, you too have a role in today's debate. If you have not already done so, please take a moment now to take your position to on today's resolve. After the adoption of the percent of market value, POMV, draw methodology by the state and our legislature, the concept of inflation proofing should not be included in the statutes that govern permanent fund management. Please let us know if you agree or disagree with this statement. You should each see a poll window open on your screen. If you have not already done so, please cast your vote now. Unfortunately, those of you joining us by phone will not be able to participate in the poll. After the closing statements, you'll be asked to vote again. Commonwealth North was founded to provide a nonpartisan public policy advisory organization to help our residents better understand the most complex topics that impact our state, ranging from the gas line, healthcare, education, infrastructure, energy, fiscal, and now food security. Our mission is to bring forward public policy recommendations from experts in that field and that are in the best interest of all Alaskans. For 40 years, Commonwealth North has filled a unique nonpartisan niche, providing Alaskans with access to policymakers, frank dialogue, and continual civic engagement. We bring clarity to issues free from political bias and advocate for thoughtful, deliberative development of public policy. Today, we have 32 members of Commonwealth North online with us, and again, we're up to 72 members all total of participants. Thank you for your membership and the tremendous work you've done to help educate Alaskans and our policy leaders on Alaska's public policy challenges. I'd also like to invite the rest of you, the other 30 so, to join us and be a member of Commonwealth North. If you have questions for today's speakers, there are two options to submit your question. For those of you calling in on your phones, please note this number, 907-230-2284. Again, that's 907-230-2284. You can text your questions to that number. If you are joining us online, please open the chat window. You can submit your question privately to me, Terry Smith. I'll scan and curate all of the questions submitted and pose them to our speakers. Juanetta, can you give us a review of the debate format, please?
Thanks, Terry. Yes, today's format will be, again, we've had our open poll for the pre-debate, and again, I'll be closing that momentarily just as we begin the opening statements. So please cast your vote now if you haven't already done so. We'll begin with an opening statement. Ralph Townsend will take the affirmative position, and he'll begin with the opening statement of 7 minutes, followed by Craig Richards with another 7-minute opening statement. Following that, we'll have a rebuttal from each position for 3 minutes. And then at the conclusion of the rebuttal, we'll open it up for questions and answers. Again, as Terry mentioned, we'll have the option for you to submit questions through the chat feature on Zoom, or you can text to 907-230-2284. Question and answers will take place over approximately 10 minutes. And then we'll have closing statements, starting with Craig Richards, and then followed by Ralph Townsend for 3 minutes. At the end of the closing statements, we'll open the post-debate poll to again answer the same question: do you agree or disagree with the resolve? So with that, I'd like to toss to Ralph Townsend to begin with the opening statement. Ralph?
Thank you very much, Terry and Juanetta. Let me jump right into the issue. Again, the resolution before us is, after the adoption of the percent of market value draw methodology by the legislature, the concept of inflation proofing should not be included in the statutes that govern permanent fund management. Let me simplify that just a bit to say, what we're arguing about today, the position I'm taking is, now that we have the percent of market value, the POMV, we no longer need inflation proofing in our statutes. Just to set a little background, let me provide the last publicly available figure for the size of our permanent fund. As of March 16th, the permanent fund had $58.7 billion. What's important for the debate today is to talk about the two components of the permanent fund. The principal, that's the part of the permanent fund which cannot be touched, and the earnings reserve. The earnings reserve are those earnings from the permanent fund that are available for appropriation by the legislature by majority vote. Again, as of March 16th, there was $42.6 billion in the principal, and there was $16.1 billion in the earnings reserve. The key issue today is around the earnings reserve. How much money do we need to keep in the earnings reserve, and what processes should we use to make that decision? Let me define briefly inflation proofing. This is a concept written into our statutes in 1982. Note that it's in statute, not the Constitution. And the legislature agreed to guide its annual appropriations in a way where a draw from the earnings reserve would be taken and deposited in the principal of the permanent fund based upon the rate of inflation. The percent of market value. While the state has talked about percent of market value concepts for a long time, it was only in 2018, in SB 26, that the percent of market value was set in statute. Under that statute, at present, 5% of the average permanent fund total balance for the last 5 years is available for appropriation from the earnings reserve. Note that the POMV must be appropriated from the earnings reserve. This is very important for today's debate. We can only have a POMV draw if there are sufficient funds in the earnings reserve. As I think Terry noted, the POMV draw, which is right around $3 billion, constitutes approximately 60% of the general fund spending in Alaska. The most recent budget just passed had $4.7 billion. So let me set out my 3 reasons why I strongly support removing inflation proofing as a concept from the statutes. The first one is very simple. Inflation proofing is simply unnecessary under the POMV. The legislature set the POMV draw rate at 5%. In setting that draw rate, the legislature was taking inflation into account. It was not appropriating the full earnings of the permanent fund. The permanent fund has earned on average about 8% over the last number of years. It's only putting in 5%. The difference between that 5% and the average 8% is in fact a set aside for inflation. Over time, a 5% draw on the permanent fund will both sustain the real value of the permanent fund and also sustain the value of the draw for the POMV. My second argument is simply that inflation proofing is not only unnecessary, it's misleading in the current context. I've already explained that inflation proofing is unnecessary under a percentage of market value draw of 5%. So why do we still hear calls for inflation proofing? Let me give you my opinion. Candidly, calls for inflation proofing are a stalking horse for a different concept, one that we might call legislature proofing or governor proofing. That is, it's a backdoor way to put more funds beyond the reach of the legislature and the governor. Now, I'm not going to debate today whether legislature proofing is a good idea. What I am saying, it's a bad idea to call legislature proofing inflation proofing. Let's get the real issue out there so people can understand it, so people are not confused by the old role of inflation proofing and what today's advocates of inflation proofing are proposing. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, inflation proofing is simply dangerous, very dangerous, under the POMV draw system. Remember, the POMV can only be paid from the earnings reserve. What happens if the earnings reserve goes to 0? Quite simply, there is no POMV. Imagine facing this year's $4.7 billion budget with, instead of $3 billion from the earnings reserve in the POMV, nothing. An extra $3 billion deficit. Clearly a fiscal catastrophe for the state. Now the question is, how big is the probability that we might run out of funds in the POMV, in the earnings reserve, to pay the POMV? Fortunately, the Alaska Permanent Fund Commission has hired a couple of consultants to look at this question, and I'll go to the report that was done in 2017 by Bridgewater. In their study, they estimated that the probability of running out of funds in the earnings reserve within the next 10 years with only a POMV, no percent of market value, only a POMV, was 15%. That may seem small, but remember, that's the roll of a die, the probability of getting 4 on a roll of a 6-sided die. But the really bad news was, what's the probability of running out of funds with inflation proofing? And Bridgewater calculated that at 44%. That is, the difference between inflation proofing and not inflation proofing is a 30% increase in the probability that the POMV will not be able to be paid. It's a coin toss probability in the next 10 years if we insist on using inflation proofing. Quite simply, to summarize, we cannot let an unnecessary, misleading concept put Alaska's fiscal future in jeopardy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ralph. And now for the counter argument, I'm pleased to welcome Craig Richards. Craig?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to present here today. And thanks to my opponent. I think Ralph did a very good job of outlining the framework of the permanent fund, and will save me the time from having to readdress it. Really what I think this debate comes down to is, what does permanent mean for the permanent fund? And what does permanency entail in light of the concept of these 2 different accounts, the ERA and the corpus? Well, historically, I think we've tended to conflate in our own minds the last 30 years that the permanent fund is just one entity. It's not two separate and distinct funds. And that's because we have a history of not doing ad hoc draws from the fund. We have had a history of not doing any draws really other than taking the dividend and maybe doing some small payments for management fees and other things from the fund itself. So this distinction of the corpus and the ERA, which is really set up by statute and at its core constitutionally, is critical. And the constitutional and statutory framework taken on their face provide that the legislature cannot spend the corpus, but they can spend, the corpus is the principal, but they can spend the earnings from the principal. And those earnings, if they are not spent by the legislature, go into another statutorily created account called the earnings reserve account that is fully subject to appropriation. Well, as I said, we haven't made a big distinction between these two accounts in the past because we didn't really view it as much of a chance that the earnings reserve would get depleted to the point that there would be a risk we didn't have the funds necessary to pay dividends. But all that's changing, and I'll address that in a minute. I think that what is useful is to go back and just very briefly touch upon why we have inflation proofing and what the history of it is. One of the first things the trustees did when the permanent fund was put into action was that they recognized that if you're really going to have a permanent fund, you need permanency in two different areas. One, you need the permanency the Constitution creates, which is you can't spend the corpus. But for the permanent fund to really be permanent, it's not enough that the corpus just not be spent. For it to have a permanency in value, it has to grow. It has to grow at least at the rate of inflation. And if that permanency is really going to be enough to offset declining oil revenues in the future, which I think was the original intent, then it has to grow at a rate higher than inflation. And that is why inflation proofing was one of the first things the trustees did. And keep in mind, this was an era in the early and mid 80s when inflation rates were often double digit. So inflation was an idea that was on people's minds every day. It wasn't sort of this loose concept of 2 or 3% inflation where a little bit of time may degrade a little value. When you're in those kind of inflation areas, you end up with real risk that the purchasing power of the fund, the corpus, would not be preserved without inflation proofing. And that's why Elmer Rasmussen famously said that inflation is like the thief in the night, because it will take away the value of the fund over time. And that's been a constant theme for the board. It was true at the time of Mr. Rasmussen's chairmanship. It was true even in low periods of inflation, and the board in Resolution 1701 and 1804, and even in the most recent trustee paper number 9, have continued to reiterate the importance of it. And let's think about what the world would have looked like without inflation proofing. There's been about $47 billion of deposits in the corpus. About 18 billion was from royalties, about 18 billion was from inflation proofing, and about 11 billion has been one-time appropriations. So that means 38% of the value of the corpus is directly from inflation proofing. Now, if you removed either the royalty deposits or the inflation proofing, you would end up with a permanent fund that didn't have inflation growth and it didn't have real growth. And I've heard it suggested that you don't need inflationary growth in the corpus because the royalty deposits, as they continue to accumulate, sort of act as an alternative way to inflation proof. And that was true for a time, but it's not true now. Royalties and inflation proofing have been about each 38% of the deposits into the corpus of the fund, the unspendable amount. But that's completely a historical artifice at this point. Royalties in fiscal year 21 are projected to be 344 million. Inflation proofing is projected to be 1.056 billion. So royalties are a much smaller slice of the forward-looking pie than inflation proofing. So if you get rid of inflation proofing, there's just no question that not only will you not have real growth in the corpus, you won't have purchasing power maintained. And I think more than ever, we really need to think in terms of the multi-generational mission of this permanent fund. I can't disagree with Ralph that inflation proofing creates some math difficulties, and I'll address that probably in my rebuttal because I don't think I'll have time to get to it in this part. But it doesn't change the nature of what the permanent fund is supposed to be, and that is an intergenerational preservation of wealth. And you're not really preserving wealth if you allow the permanent fund to shrink, not only not grow in real terms, but to shrink in inflation-adjusted terms. And we talked about earlier, I did, why we tend to merge in our minds the ERA and the corpus, and maybe that's not really appropriate anymore. And that difference is really brought into relief by the change in the structure, as Ralph alluded to. In 2015, something unique happened. Oil prices fell, and by 2016, we stopped following some of the rules around the permanent fund, and the legislature began to doing things ad hoc. They stopped setting dividends by the formula, and they stopped inflation proofing for 3 years in fiscal year 16 through fiscal year 18. And certain statutory royalties weren't deposited in the corpus as state law requires in fiscal years 18 and 19. And then with the adoption of the permanent fund with a percentage of market value in fiscal year 19, we immediately created a very grave risk that the legislature and the state as a whole is going to get used to spending permanent fund monies in a way that will put extra pressure on the ERA. And so far in the 2 years that the percentage of market value has been adopted, the legislature has not drawn more than a PMOV methodology would allow, but it's been precarious. I mean, the governor has certainly encouraged full dividends and a full PMOV payment. Just in the last week or two, the virus crisis resulted in the legislature, at least the Senate, appropriating a dividend that would have overdrawn the PMOV. And of course, once you draw beyond the PMOV, any argument that inflation proofing is accounted for goes out the door. And I think in this fiscal environment, we have to recognize that the probabilities of overdraws are very high. So if we want to maintain the value of this fund for the next generation, we have to accept the risk of the ERA being spent down like the CBR and SBR in the last couple of years. And the only true way to maintain the value for our next generation is to continue to inflation proof. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Craig. And now for a rebuttal statement, Ralph Townsend.
Microphone, Ralph.
Yeah.
I find myself in a very difficult position in that Craig didn't address two of the three arguments I put forward and really illustrated the third. What did Craig say about inflation proofing being unnecessary if the draw is equal to 5%? He said nothing, because it's true. What did Craig say about inflation proofing being dangerous? He promised to tell you after I get done speaking what's wrong with that argument. That's not exactly fair, folks. So what did he talk about? He really talked about the second point. He said, here's all the reasons why inflation proofing are good, which have nothing to do with inflation. That was exactly my point. That is the argument that people are making. People are pretending that we are protecting the corpus from inflation when what we are protecting them from is either, in Craig's argument, we need to make it grow in real terms. Let's have that debate. Let's talk about a real growth contribution to the corpus. But let's not kid ourselves and call it inflation proofing. So quite simply, from a debating sense, Craig has illustrated my second point and failed to address the other two. I think he's in trouble. But I have an extra minute, so let me address the issue that Craig did bring up, which was that we need to take power out of the hands of the legislature and put it on some sort of autopilot. We need to write a formula that binds the legislature good times and bad. Quite candidly, I believe that the legislature's decision to suspend inflation proofing in the last couple of years, given the financial uncertainties, was extremely prudent. It's what a financial manager who is managing the overall books of the state would have told you to do. We do need the legislature to make judgments on our behalf in financial matters. We cannot put financial matters on some sort of mathematical autopilot. I know that's what many people want, but candidly, I have faith in our legislature, and that faith is founded in, after all, as Craig pointed out, of the $47 billion in the corpus, $11 billion was put by the legislature there above and beyond inflation proofing. So I don't think the goal of taking power from the legislature justifies continuing this unnecessary, misleading, and dangerous policy. Thank you.
All right, and Craig Richards for 3 minutes.
Well, I think that, you can adopt rhetoric that sort of mislabels something or calls something what it isn't, but inflation proofing is inflation proofing, and the purpose all along has been to keep those funds from being spent by the legislature and to keep those funds an amount to at least grow the corpus of the fund enough to keep up with inflation and preserve that wealth to the next generation. So, you can call it legislative proofing or whatever title you want, but it doesn't change what it is, which is a way to preserve the inflation value adjusted of the corpus of the fund over time in perpetuity. And I think it would be a grave mistake to the next generation to not do that. Now, I did briefly address that under the PMOV approach, it is unnecessary to have inflation proofing. I agree it is unnecessary in the long term from a mathematical perspective if you combine the funds, but that's not true if you believe there is a significant risk that the ERA will be spent down as the CBR and SBR have been. And I think it's quite naive to pretend that that risk is not only possible, but is staring in our face, and there's a high probability of it in the last couple of years. The final thing about inflation proofing is dangerous, which Ralph said, is, at most, I think you can say that inflation proofing in its present context is dangerous because it creates a risk of, the inflation proofing drawing the ERA down in any given year when market cycles are low, such as the ERA runs a significant risk of not being able to fund the PMOV. But and I agree with his math that the risk is anywhere from 50% with inflation proofing to something like 15% if you don't have inflation proofing. But what the analysis, one of the ones that the Permanent Fund just did a few weeks ago, showed is that this best way to do inflation proofing is to adjust the statute such that you don't do inflation proofing automatically every year. Instead, you do it automatically in years where the ERA balance is high. So what the Permanent Fund has recommended, and I think is a good solution to some of the horribles that Ralph has paraded, is that you adopt what the Permanent Fund calls the 4 times rule, which is that you inflation proof, but you stop inflation proofing if the ERA balance is less than 3 times the expected current draw. And then when it gets over 4 times the current draw, then you make up your retro inflation proofing. And that is demonstrated by the Permanent Fund to really reduce the short-term risk of the Permanent Fund draws in terms of not being able to make your PMOV payments. So with that, I'd like to thank my opponent and thank the audience, and wish everyone a good day.
Okay, thank you, Craig. All right, and so now we'll go to a 10-minute question and answer period, and Terry and I will be tag teaming this. Terry, can you, I don't see any questions popping up in chat just yet, and I need to switch over. And I don't see any in text at the moment, so we're waiting for questions from the audience.
We were obviously crystal clear.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any hit Zoom yet on the chat line. Then let me repeat the number for the text for those that are calling on the phones. That is 907-230-2284. You can text your questions to that number.
Okay, and I did have one question just come in, Terry.
Okay.
The questioners asked, the legislature just blew through $18 billion in the earnings reserve. Are they responsible enough to trust?
Which of us first?
We'll go with you on screen, Ralph, and then Craig.
Okay. First of all, it's important to note the legislature did not go through $18 billion in the earnings reserve. That was from the statutory budget reserve and the constitutional budget reserve. Those are completely separate. So we need to keep that separate. On the other hand, Craig raises the point that should the legislature be allowed in really difficult times to reach into the earnings reserve to handle Alaska's problems. And the question of whether we should do that in the current context is a very real one that we probably ought to debate separately. But I want to make clear here, if that's your goal, if your goal is to put the Permanent Fund on autopilot without legislative involvement, call it that. It is not protecting the fund from inflation. Inflation can still eat into the value of the fund. The only way to protect the fund from inflation would be to invest in inflation-proof bonds, a really crummy investment, by the way. It is the nature of investing that one manages a portfolio to manage portfolio risk, and one manages draws to manage inflation risk. The legislature has done that. by setting the POMV goal.
And Craig?
So I would agree with Ralph that the legislature has not spent the roughly $20 billion out of the ERA yet, I think is the concern. That, the last 5 years, we've really spent the, roughly $20 billion out of our state savings to essentially pay for a deficit structural hole. And we haven't had to tap the ERA except for the PMOV yet. But guess what? The deficit structural hole is still there. We've made no super progress in closing it other than getting rid of oil and gas credits and adopting the PMOV. And all of our other state savings accounts are over. So that means very seriously, there is a risk in the next few years, if we are unable to come to compromise as to closing the budget shortfalls, that the ERA will be the only remaining available savings account to be spent to fund our structural deficits. So that's all a long way of saying that, the permanent fund, and I certainly have advocated for rules-based systems. Ralph calls it autopilot. But if we don't have a mechanism where we have a sustainable amount only taken from the permanent fund every year, and we do run high risks of ad hoc draws above a sustainable 5%, then we will degrade the value of that fund very rapidly, potentially, and we will rob the next generation of its value.
I have a private question that came in, Juanetta.
Yes. So we have a question. The POMV method was first touted several years ago during the Murkowski administration. At that time, it was promoted as a methodical approach akin to how many other similar funds around the world handle their draws. Do these funds inflation proof? So do other sovereign wealth funds inflation proof?
Let me step in here and say, the issue around inflation proofing is because of, and also the POMV draw, is because of the unique situation of having the principal separate from the earnings reserve. And while I'm not an expert on all of the funds in the world, and Craig has done a little work there, that is not the common setup. Usually it's all one pot of money, and then a POMV draw is made from that. And certainly, I think many people would favor that from Alaska, but it's not what's allowable under our current constitution. And this debate today is fundamentally linked to what's in our current constitution.
Yeah, I would agree with Ralph in all parts of that. The artifice of needing to inflation proof to preserve the value of the corpus exists solely because we have this distinction between the earnings of the fund that go into a separate account in the principal or corpus of the fund, which remains unspendable. There are only a couple of states like Wyoming that have that similar structure that I'm aware of, and they do inflation proof. But other than that, no one else has this breaking up of the accounts. And clearly the superior solution, which is not before us, is to eliminate this distinction between the accounts. And then the need for inflation proofing does go away.
Oh, okay, we have another question. There seems to be a huge knowledge gap between the reality of the constitutional budget reserve being depleted and the expectation or understanding by Alaskans who still demand a full permanent fund dividend. How do we fix this disconnect?
Can I leave that to Craig?
You beat me, Ralph. I was about to say, I think Ralph's all over that one. This is way outside of the debate. It's just my point of view. There's only a couple of things we can do to solve our budget surplus. We can reduce our dividends, we can increase oil taxes, we can adopt broad-based taxation, and we can cut the government. These are the only 4 tools we have. And each of these 4 tools has a very strong constituency that does not want to see that thing happen. Lots of people don't want the dividend cut. Lots of people don't want more oil taxes. Lots of people don't want broad-based taxation, and lots of people don't want reduced government services through government cuts. So effectively, I don't view reducing the dividend as much different than all of these other 3 protected constituencies out there. We're all going to have to, this is my view, we're all going to have to compromise, and we're all going to have to give up a little bit of something if we're going to close a $1 billion half hole. And it's not enough to just reduce the dividend. We probably got to do all 4 of those things, or at least 3 of them. So that's my view.
I would agree that Alaska obviously faces a painful choice. The good old days of when there was plenty of money to do everything and it was paid for by oil revenues is past. And it is very painful and it is politically difficult. I have great empathy for the politicians who must work their way through this. It is a real challenge. It was until a month ago, the most important issue facing Alaska.
Okay, we have a question from Gunnar Knapp. Would the issue go away if we had a constitutional amendment limiting draws to a sustainable rate, as he advocated during our last debate?
I think that's what Craig said in an answer to a previous question, and I would agree. If we had a constitutional amendment that set up an entirely different structure, we certainly wouldn't be debating either inflation proofing or the POMV.
And I'll just say from the Permanent Fund Board's perspective, they have supported such a constitutional amendment. I mean, I think Eric was chair when they were adopting the first resolutions in support, or at least on the board in 99 through 2003, I think it was. And the board continues to be in support of that change if the legislature and the people of the state of Alaska also support it. Because it not only solves the inflation proofing issue, it solves the mathematical difficulty of what happens if the ERA balance gets close to zero and you run a risk of not being able to fund the PMOV. Because if you combine the accounts and you follow, a 5% draw rule, you never have to worry about not having the cash, and you never have to worry about overdraws. So it's kind of a double solution to the two big problems facing the fund.
There's a private message that question that kind of, I think, relates to that, obviously, is how do we adjust the POMV over time to address this, these periods when we have sustained returns less than 5%?
Well, let me say that a sustained return of 5% has been virtually all of the endowment funds in the U.S. Have been able to do that. It is true that many of the private endowments have some flexibility in their draw, and they go up and down a little bit based on long-term trends. But I think there's general agreement that the 5% figure is viable over a very long period of time.
I would concur with that. The Permanent Fund, the CIO, Marcus Frampton, did a very excellent modeling exercise that he presented at the last board meeting, where he went back and looked at 100 years of fund performance. And he said, okay, what if the markets and inflation act as if it had been every year for the last 100 years for a 20-year period? So, 1900 through 1920, 1921 through 1941, et cetera. And he did that, and he created a big data sample. And I think what he showed is that if the future looks anything like the past, and it probably will over long periods of time, the 5% will work. It will just, in certain periods of time, you will get these crunches where you'll have cash call problems, where the ERA will get reduced. And what the modeling demonstrated is, in those periods of extreme cash distress, like we could potentially be entering into now, by the way, the best solution isn't to reduce the PMOV, it is to temporarily cease inflation proofing. So put that one in Ralph's column.
Okay, one last call for any final questions. Okay, gentlemen, I don't see anything. Terry, do you have anything coming in your channel?
I do not.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and conclude with closing statements then. Oh, wait a minute. I spoke too soon. We do have a question. The Permanent Fund Defenders ask if you support a constitutional permanent fund dividend in a POMV. Do you know the POMV won't pass a public vote without it?
Quite candidly, that's completely separate from the issue we're debating today. It gets into a very complicated and political issue. Perhaps Craig wants to weigh in on it, but it's really not relevant to today's debate.
Oh, I'll just say that, echoing the position the board has taken, they don't take a position on what the dividend should be and whether it should or should not be included in the constitutional amendment. The practical realities of, is it necessary to get a constitutional amendment passed? I don't know that. I'm not close enough to the legislature every day to know what is politically feasible and what isn't.
Okay. All right, we'll take that as the last question then. So we'll proceed to closing statements, and we'll start with Craig Richards for 3 minutes.
I think when we look at the history of the permanent fund, one of the things that jumps out is the true brilliance of the people that created this body, that created the institution, that created the idea of the savings, and that created the apolitical organization that developed into a world-class asset manager and a governmental entity with a great governance structure. And I think we should continue the work of those good people to recognize the need to inflation-proof. The present needs always run a risk of swamping the needs of the next generation. And nowhere is it more important that we keep the next generation in mind than when we think about preserving the long-term value of the permanent fund. You know, I think you can say that the baby boomers and Generation X, we have spent a large portion of our oil wealth that got developed in the 80s and the 90s and the thousands, and we did it without preserving as much wealth as maybe we could have. I think the very last thing, the very least we can do with that history is preserve it for the next generation. And that's particularly true if you look at the last 10 years. You know, we had, before 2015, $6, $5, $8 billion budgets. And then after 2015, you know, our budgets maintained themselves at $4.5, $5 billion, but with structural holes of $1.5 to $2 billion. And we've been spending down all of our savings. If we continue on this path, we will have truly reduced the preserved value of oil development to almost nothing, except for what's in the permanent fund. And, you know, TAPS is at 500,000 barrels a day. It's not going to go back to 1 million barrels a day, much less 2 million barrels a day, barring some kind of technological change that's completely unforeseen. So for that reason, I think we need to take prudent steps to maintain inflation proofing to ensure our next generation has some of that oil wealth value preserved. And I think probably the most prudent step we can take is to not get rid of inflation proofing, recognizing its value, but instead to slightly alter the inflation proofing formulas such that we stop inflation proofing when the ARA balance gets very low, below 3 times the expected draw, but we kick inflation proofing back on when the ARA balances rise, particularly above 4 times the expected draw, and we make up our back inflation proofing. And a little bit under this very tortured structure, we can have our cake and eat it too. We can inflation proof, but we can do it in a way that does not overly endanger our ability to make our short-term cash calls.
All right. And Ralph, your closing statement for 3 minutes.
Thank you. Well, again, I find myself in a difficult position. My first point that it's unnecessary, Craig said, yes, it's unnecessary in the long run. But that point is in my column. My third point was, it's dangerous. And Craig said, yeah, but we can sort of fix that. It's dangerous. The real point, and where this debate has been at, is my disagreement with Craig over using inflation proofing as a stalking horse for a different issue. I agree with Craig that we should consider in an open discussion what kinds of rules are necessary for maintaining an appropriate level in the earnings reserve. I think the position of some, including, I fear, the Permanent Fund Board, is that inflation proofing is a winning horse. If we use that word, we will get our way in this discussion. And a good example of that is Craig blithely throws in a suggestion 4 times the earnings reserve is quite adequate. The modeling suggests that a 4-time rules is still a 15% chance that we won't meet the draw. Let's have a discussion about what is the level that we need the earnings reserve to be at. What are the new sets of rules? Not something paraded as inflation proofing, but a clear set of rules that deal with transfer policies between the earnings reserve and the corpus. We need to do that. We need to have an open discussion. We can't have one side grabbing the moral high ground by calling it inflation proofing. That is really what is going on today. Let me close by thanking Commonwealth North for allowing ICER to sponsor really the second of 2 debates on the permanent fund. Obviously, the permanent fund is very valuable. And obviously, I want to thank Craig for being such a capable opponent today. But I really want to thank Commonwealth North for being willing to put forward something in the traditional debating context, something, albeit delivered by modern Zoom technology, but still a debate in which it's not the personalities, but rather it's the issues that are important to Alaska. I know that Craig and I both want to win this debate. And I suspect that at least one of us, perhaps me, failed to achieve the stature of the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. But I do hope that this debate has perhaps left our audience feeling having a little more knowledge about the issues surrounding managing our most important asset. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ralph. So you've heard the assertions, rebuttals, and closing statements from our debaters, and we're going to open up our post-debate poll. So once again, we'll ask you to vote on whether or not you agree or disagree with the resolved statement. And as you're casting your vote, I'll toss it back to our president, Terry Smith. Terry?
Well, I'd first like to thank our panelists that joined us today. You did a great job, articulated the positions well, and we appreciated your energy and the time you spent on this and bringing it to us. So thank you for your partnership and your energy. Thank you also, ICER, for sponsoring today's program. Ralph, thank you for your support. You know, it's the support of our sponsors and members that enable Commonwealth North to fulfill our mission and bring you programs like this one today. I encourage all of you to become a member, and you know, we are all struggling to figure out how to work with the new realities and adjust over hopefully the short term. You know, hopefully it wraps up this virus cycle over the next couple months, hopefully. But as we adjust to our new normal and work with that, we appreciate your support and anything that you can do to help the organization maintain and keep its doors open. We encourage you to do that. Please see the links provided in the chat window and visit commonwealthnorth.org to join or donate and support civil discourse, citizen engagement, and nonpartisan engagement in sound public policies.